We're getting close to the first State of the Union address of Barack Obama. And when this plays, perhaps it just happened. But if you recall, it was in George W. Bush's 2002 speech that he first coined the term axis of evil to describe his vision of North Korea, Iraq, and Iran. The U.S. has a new president who has made a fairly big and controversial deal about his willingness to meet with Iran's leaders without preconditions. Iran's last presidential election in 2005 brought the world Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Another presidential election is coming soon, actually in June, to Iran. And my guest today has spent a good deal of time in Iran since the year 2000 and written 2 books about Iranian society. I'll talk with AZADEH Moaveni about life and politics behind the caricatures and the rhetoric that so often clouds U.S. perceptions of Iran. AZADEH Moaveni is a contributing writer on Iran and the Middle East for Time magazine. She spent 2 years in Iran from 2005 to 2007 and just returned from 3 weeks there at the first of the year. As one of the few American correspondents allowed to work continuously in Iran since 1999, she has reported widely on youth culture, women's rights, Islamic reform for Time, the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the LA Times. She's author of Lipstick Jihad and co-author with Nobel Peace Prize winner Shirin Ebadi of Iran Awakening. Her newest book is Honeymoon in Tehran, 2 Years of Love and Danger in Iran. Welcome again, AZADEH Moaveni.
Thank you very much.
And I say again because I had the pleasure of interviewing you and Afshin Latifi, author of Even After All This Time, and Asne Sirstad, author of The Bookseller of Kabul, at the LA Times Book Festival in 2005.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I felt, wow, what a coup, the 3 of you at one time. It was great. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So if you can do this, what has been your relationship with Iran over the years? You know, where were you born? When have you been back? Where does your family kind of situate? All of that.
Well, my parents left Iran in the late 60s to go to university in the U.S. in California, and they ended up never really going back. So the rest of the family left in 1979, but we had been settled in Northern California. And apart from one childhood trip back, as an adult, I had never experienced modern Iran. So when I finished college, I was eager to see what this country, this post-revolutionary country, was actually like. So I went back on my own as an adult to discover it.
Okay, and that was?
My first trip back was in 1998. And I went back again in 99 to cover the very exciting and dramatic student protests of that year. And then I moved there in 2000 as a reporter for Time magazine.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, is when it became professional for Time. And here's another setup sort of question. This one not so personal. But I imagine there are listeners who know very well the history of Iran, and probably some who do not. So I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. Very brief histories of the pre-revolution, starting with the democratic government that was there in the 50s. Well,
in the early 50s, there was perhaps the most democratically elected and popular government of the entire 20th century. The government of Prime Minister Mossadegh. He was unfortunately overthrown in a coup in 1953 by a U.S. and British coup. And that brought back the very unpopular and autocratic regime of the Shah. Resentment towards him and his very tyrannic rule came to a head in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. And that sort of trajectory shows how Iran's sort of brief experiment with democracy was really cut short, and that paved the way for years of different types of tyranny.
Okay, and now from the revolution to the present, again, the brief history of the ups and downs.
Well, the period immediately after the revolution was just entirely consumed by the 10-year war with Iraq. So really the 90s after the war was a period of reconstruction, rebuilding after this devastating war. And then the late 1990s was really a period of political contestation. That was the sort of time when the rise of the moderates came to the national attention of Iranians, and there became a real struggle over the future of the country, over the nature of the revolution.
Okay, so this rise of the moderates, this is a lot of what you wrote about in Lipstick Jihad, correct? What what does that really mean? What did it mean then, and how are its vestiges alive today?
It meant on the political side that politicians, revolutionaries, were experimenting with the idea of democratizing the Islamic Republic. Can Islam and democracy be reconciled in the shape of the Iranian Islamic Republic? On the people side, on the grassroots side, it was a time of ordinary people trying to transform society through daily life by pushing the boundaries, listening to band music, having parties at home, by trying to transform their country through daily life rather than through the system.
Mm-hmm. And of those two strains, the ones that were active for political change and the ones that said, okay, we'll let the politics stay the way it is, we'll change so that it doesn't affect us as much. How have those two tracks, if you will, played out?
The political track has sadly been a tumultuous and sort of unsuccessful one. I think a lot of politicians concluded that the legal structure of Iran just didn't really permit for real democratic change. So they're still pushing within the confines of the system, but there's a real awareness of how little meaningful change can be accomplished within the framework of the Constitution, for example. The grassroots sort of people level has been much more interesting because that's where people have really managed to really just transform Iranian society through individual actions. There's now a thriving underground music scene. Iranian painting is sort of capturing the world's attention. Film has never been more of a place for people to figure out how they feel about change and modernity. So that's where the excitement is happening.
And how do those two strands interact? Let's say, how do they interact from the point of view of the political leaders? How do they interact from the point of view of an individual Iranian?
I think that the way they interact is fluid. I think that there's a swinging back and forth between apathy and engagement. There are times when young people especially are just so disenchanted with political change that they withdraw, they turn inwards, they focus on making money and finding a nice apartment and emigrating to the West, and they just are bored and apathetic and don't really care about political change. And then there are times when it becomes clear that even though all of the candidates are Islamic and operate within the system, there are very real differences between them. Life under an Ahmadinejad is very different than life under a moderate Khatami, for example. It makes a difference in how you dress and what films you can watch and whether there's going to be a knock at your door if you have a party. So sometimes the pendulum shifts back towards voting, towards thinking about making a decision and engaging.
Well, let me ask about that when you say whether there'll be a knock at the door and so on. In other words, it sounds like you're saying that the cultural changes, the lifestyle changes go on. It seems like the question is whether you feel relaxed living the life you're living or whether you're paranoid.
That's the sad thing, I think, is that even though freedoms sort of contract and expand, and there are times of actually very lively debate, there's a sort of flourishing literary press, and there are times when cultural life really opens up, because there's no continuity in terms of the freedoms that the state is willing to tolerate, people are sort of permanently paranoid. And I think that's what makes life in Iran so overwhelming and distressing for people.
I see, and that would be even in good times.
Even in good times.
And right now, Iran is having a very tough time economically, yes?
Yes, the combination of falling oil prices, the global collapse, and the Iranian economy, which was just a disaster to begin with, is just really gouging people's quality of life.
Mm-hmm. And I mentioned to you off air that I recently went and heard Reza Aslan speak, and people who are familiar with Reza, he lives in Southern California. He wrote the book No God But God, which I highly recommend. Is a very readable history of Islam, and he's working on a new book now. I believe the title will be How to Win a Cosmic War. But when I went to this gathering where he was speaking, he realized, and sitting in the audience, I realized that basically I was one of the very few who wasn't a Persian, who wasn't an immigrant from Iran. And so it was really like he was, talking to his people, and I was a fly on the wall. He said that, and I want, one of the things I thought would be very cool would be to get your reflection on this. He said, though it is a dictatorship, popular opinion matters. Students want a lot of what they wanted in the 90s, and he felt it was a deal that the mullahs let the students do whatever they want in their own homes, and student let mullahs have the control. And they didn't vote in the last election, but he believes that they will this time. And that revolution, he said, is no one even expects it anymore. Mm-hmm. But reform, he believes, will be slow and gradual. Mm-hmm. Your take on all of that?
I think that's very astute, and I would certainly agree that the government flirts with that kind of policy of buying off young people with social freedoms so that they can be dictators in the political system. However, I think that that's kind of expired as the MO, as if you will, of the regime. Because there are times when the economy just gets so bad, or that the nuclear program becomes so inflamed in terms of relations with the West that the government decides it needs to crack down at home to distract people. And so the old bargain has sort of been cast aside as the government tries to deal with the very tumultuous times that it finds itself in now.
Oh, I see. As tensions escalate, and these are just the tensions of life, mm-hmm. then this bargain deteriorates. You wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal in January that I read, which I assume was written after the book had been sent off to be published and so on. But it really talked, you focused initially on a crackdown on Shirin Ebadi, but you said it was more than that there is some sort of a crackdown going on. Tell us about that, what that means to an individual in Iran, and whether you assume that might be ongoing from now until the election.
Mm-hmm. Well, my reading of the stepped-up harassment against Shirin Ebadi was that the government was really trying to alienate the silent majority, that it wanted young Iranians in particular to feel that their voice didn't make a difference. It wanted them to stay at home on election day so that turnout would be low. And the model of Iran is that when turnout is low, hardliners do well in elections. And hardliners...
I think it's true here, too.
And that's how Ahmadinejad got elected in 2005. Turnout was comparatively low, and I think they're hoping for that again, because certainly if turnout is high, Khatami will win by a landslide.
Right, and Khatami, to identify for, again, to remind people, he served as president 2 terms?
Yes.
And was the moderate who came in on a wave of optimism and then found his freedom quite circumscribed. And here he is running again. What does that mean, that he's running again?
I think it means that things have gotten so bad in Iran, economically, in terms of just the fracture in relations with the West, that people and the moderates that Khatami symbolizes feel that the country needs to be rescued from this sort of path of fundamentalism that Ahmadinejad turned everyone down.
Mm-hmm. Now, see, your last sentence surprised me. Because as it looked to me, reading others and so on, that Ahmadinejad is a figurehead, that Ahmadinejad is a rabble-rouser, but that the lives of most people, prior maybe to this recent increased crackdown, that there was a big disconnect between Americans' perception of Ahmadinejad, his role in Iranian society, and the reality.
Well, I think although he's certainly caricatured, in terms of what his presidency, how it was experienced by ordinary people, it was really a very dark time. He sends mullahs to government offices to tell people to go pray and suggest that they'll be penalized if they don't. A friend of mine who's a teacher was fired in December because she didn't pass the sort of "Are you Islamic enough?" test that is now current again in schools. So a lot of this ideological...
And let me just break in. Losing a job right now with the economy the way it is a really harsh punishment.
Yeah, especially in Tehran, where inflation is at sort of 200% and families can't afford to eat meat anymore. So apart from the sort of the Holocaust-denying caricature of Ahmadinejad, he's really he's sunken Iranian life in so many different ways. Censorship has been incredibly stepped up. A sort of sociology textbook is now sort of censored. So people are really hurting in every way that you can imagine.
Do you think that that they will be able to push Ebadi to boycott, and would that matter as much as it did last time?
I think that they're certainly doing everything they can to get her to boycott. Now, whether she does in the end or not, I think is a really open question, and we'll have to watch because that'll be interesting to see. But I think that people will perhaps have realized the cost that they paid for boycotting. They thought that the Khatami years were dismal. They didn't really know what dismal could be like. And so my sense is that a lot of people may at the last minute decide to vote just to ward off the greater evil.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, obviously things are very different on matter of degree and scale and everything, but the folks who voted Nader in 2000 saying the Democrats and Republicans were the same, took them 8 years to wake up, but we had the biggest turnout in a long time when people finally realized what that brought. To talk a little bit more about the economy there, another thing that Reza Aslan said was he said Iran needs oil at 90 a barrel to balance its budget, and oil at 150, Iran's a thriving society. Oil at 37, which I think it is right now, Iran is near collapse.
It's an important point to make because it's true. Iran doesn't get to spend as though it's an era of high oil prices, because economic sanctions are so hurting the economy that the government needs to use the surplus revenue for all its subsidies to sort of help out different sectors of the economy that are suffering. And so it doesn't have any revenue to save away. And that's exactly true. Low oil prices are catastrophic for Iran right now because of sanctions, because of many different factors in the economy.
Mm-hmm. One other thing, when I looked at the 2005 election, in addition to the boycotts, it struck me, and I looked at it also in light of the Hamas-Fatah election in Palestine, that the West, the U.S. specifically, backed corruption. And that if you keep backing corruption and you herald democracy, and there are lots of folks who vote, you very well may lose. And, I mean, that was, as well, part of that 2005 election. Khatami is less viewed as corrupt than Rafsanjani?
Certainly, yes. I think that it's sad that in so many different ways, U.S. democracy advocacy in the region just does backfire dramatically, whether it's backing corrupt regimes, as you say, and sort of lending strength that sort of the opposition groups wouldn't have otherwise, in the case of Iran, diverting congressional money to support democracy, which has just ended up in the gutting of Iranian civil society.
Explain that, because that's a bank shot, sort of, to use a pool term. In other words, it's not obvious that would do it, but it does it because of a reaction to it?
Well, the money is sort of couched, or has been couched, in terms of trying to change the regime peacefully from within. And so the Iranian government, sort of paranoid as it is, being suspicious of elements of civil society like NGOs, like the media, felt in that announcement that it had a real reason to be paranoid. And so even though it hasn't always looked for pretext to crack down, it actually felt like it had a very real fear.
It was handed one.
It was handed one. And that just has resulted in, really, I think, Iranian civil society now, I mean, we can't even really talk about one. It doesn't really exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. And, again, this crackdown that we talked about, crackdown on visible leaders, crackdown on are you religious enough, the white van. Tell us about the white van, because you have had to deal with that, correct?
Yes, the white van sort of showed up a couple of years ago, and they're the morality police vans. And they're there on the street patrolling to make sure that men and women who are in each other's company are related, to make sure that women are following the Islamic dress code, to make sure that cars aren't playing Western music or carrying alcohol in the trunk. They have a really vast mandate to police morals. And very often they don't enforce any of that, but their lurking presence on each corner sort of creates this fear. That's sort of the point, to keep Iranians intimidated so that they sort of remember who's in power.
Right. I'm Terry McNally, and I'm speaking with AZADEH MOAVENI. We're talking about Iran today. Her newest book is Honeymoon in Tehran, 2 Years of Love and Danger in Iran, and you can learn more at AZADEH, A-Z-A-D-E-H, azadeh.info. Another thing that Reza Aslan said that I thought was interesting was he said that I used to call Iran a mullahocracy, but now I call it a mafia-ocracy. That the power structure that emerged after 79 has become so much the mullahs, the Republican Army, the elites and so on, that basically they have their fingers in everything, and it's no longer the van might be about morality, but the government isn't. The other thing he said, and this is the one that I think is a contradiction that I can't quite figure out, is a van is going around looking for people listening to rock music, and yet prostitution is everywhere. There's a certain kind of freedom and not. What is that?
It's chaos. It's just chaos and I think that that's what modern Iran really is. It's chaos because you have the van and you have, what does the van stand for? The van stands for the 7th century, brutal 7th century policing. But then you have government health workers handing prostitutes free condoms. You have free condoms being distributed in prison to men. You have drug users being given clean needles. And so it's a government that encompasses the most backwards fundamentalism and yet at the same time real pragmatism, sort of real practicing forward-looking policies when it comes to AIDS, when it comes to sexual health, when it comes to drug use. And that's what's sad about Iran.
Oh, that was the other thing. He said a lot of drugs and drug addiction.
Yes. I mean, heroin is terribly cheap. It comes across the border from Afghanistan. And the rates are just astonishingly high. It's very sad. And the government has been slow to respond to this. It's doing better now, but, and there's a culture of drug use among young people too, party drugs, ecstasy.
So this goes back to that thing I said of let the students or the young people do what they want behind closed doors?
Exactly.
And when you match that, I would imagine, with economic disaster.
Yes, there's definitely.
And the population, the demographic bubble, which is what, 70% of the country under 25?
Exactly.
And unemployment?
Probably 20%.
So, you mix that stew.
You mix that stew and you realize, and that's why there's a strain of thinking that thinks, well, the government wants people to be anesthetized, whether it's drugs or with alcohol. That's why there's a willingness to sort of turn a blind eye to a lot of these problems.
Okay. So we've got about 2 more minutes. What I want to do is I want to give you those last 2 minutes and say, we've covered a lot of ground quickly, but what should people know and what should they look for? We're saying we're going to engage more, and the question is, will Obama engage before the presidential election or after? I will tell you, again, Reza Aslan's assumption, he said he thinks that what will happen is there will be a lot of back-channel stuff before anything hits the official news so that both sides can guarantee some kind of success. What should people be looking for between now and the election in June?
I think that's right. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations that have been going on and will go on because the issues are just so fraught for both sides domestically that it's just easier to sort of negotiate privately and then sort of come forward once some of the core issues have been addressed.
Again, just looking at our former president and Iran's current president and the two of them, being considered, fools by so many in their own country and yet, saber-rattling at each other. Final question on nuclear. My assumption is that, from asking a lot of folks in L.A., is that all sectors of society, as a matter of sort of pride, say we deserve nuclear power if we want it or need it, and may need it because of the economy. But what about the relationship of nuclear power, nuclear weapons?
Well, the debate in Iran is really a false debate because the media controls it. No one talks about the other aspect of the program, the idea that this could be for the sake of a weapons program. And so people don't really have the full picture. And so when they respond and say, yeah, we absolutely support nuclear policy, it's very much sort of in response to a really narrow and sort of false debate, which is why when you sit and talk with people, you realize that their opinions are much more nuanced. There's a lot of ambivalence, there's a lot of worry, and so I think that idea can easily be repackaged and sold to Iranians in a different way. It's not a foregone conclusion that everyone's behind this.
Okay, very good. So again, the book is Honeymoon in Tehran, 2 Years of Love and Danger in Iran, and the website is AZADEH, AZADEH.info. Thank you, AZADEH MOAVENI, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much.